about, I'm going to just switch gears a little bit. You had talked about your work with the Western premiers, and you talked about promoting your work. You mentioned cough, and there's a few things with respect to cough and your conversations with Western premiers that I want to touch on. But I want to just, I guess, start with the most basic element of that, which is sort of the toing and the froing to the Western premiers, and you mentioned flying out to meet with other premiers and all that kind of stuff. So I think I know the answer to this because I've actually been on the plane with you on occasion. I suspect that like me, you enjoy the benefit of not needing as much leg room as and so I assume you don't fly first class when you fly.
Yeah. I think the rule is if that government only pays for economy tickets, and so I think my standard is to fly in economy. I think once or twice I've gotten complimentary upgrades that I didn't ask for, which I used especially for a red-eye flight, so I could actually get a couple hours of sleep. But I believe the government does not pay for business class seats.
All right, and can you just walk me through a little bit the policy that you have with respect to flying commercial flights versus charter flights?
We fly commercially wherever possible, and I believe the only time I've used a charter flight since becoming premier was a couple of times to go up north to visit the wildfire situation in the summer when there was no commercial flights available, and in one instance where we offered to provide transportation assistance for several premiers and officials flying from Calgary to Saskatoon to go from a premiers meeting that I hosted to the Council of the Federation. So I'm not sure what exactly the criteria are, but under policy, but we've complied with those criteria.
Right. So that's actually a little bit what I wanted to talk about was that flight from Calgary to Saskatoon, where we saw a number of conservative premiers, their staff, and indeed their wives, flown to Saskatoon after they joined you in Calgary for the Premier's Pancake Breakfast. Now, we know that when you flew back from Saskatoon, the cost of your flight was just under $400. And the same for the people who were with you, which I believe was, you had 4 other people, and so it amounted to just under $2,000. But that your flight there was $16,000. And you flew there on a private charter for $16,000. And did any of the premiers refund the province of Alberta for the fact that we flew them from Calgary to Saskatoon?
I don't know the answer to that question, Chair. I'd be happy to look into that, get back to Ms. Notley, but I do know that we arranged that partly because we wanted to invite a number of premiers who shared our concerns about resource issues, economic growth. We wanted to have essentially an opportunity to meet with them before the Council of the Federation, host them in Alberta. And the only way to make that happen with their then visit to a Council of the Federation, and particularly a full day visiting the First Nations community, was to get them to Saskatoon because the commercial flight schedules did not work. And we thought this was a expression of hospitality by Alberta to help arrange the logistics on that. And I think altogether something like 25 people traveling on that charter.
No, I think there's about 16 people on that charter. Okay. I think it cost Albertans about $16,000. Had you flown the same way you flew back, it would have cost Albertans just under $2,000. And we spent the money to fly those premiers. Why are we paying for other premiers to fly around the country? That's I'll tell you, in the 4 years that I was premier, in the whole many meetings that I had with premiers, it never occurred to me that I would need to be the one in the middle of the party going, "Hey guys, I got a plane, hop on." Like, why did we think that was the thing that we would do?
Mr. Chair, I was absolutely explicit in our election campaign and before it that it was essential that Alberta build alliances with like-minded provinces. Under the previous government, Alberta was largely isolated in the Federation. Now, I'm pleased to say we had 9 of the 10 premiers agree at the COF to call for energy and resource corridors, including oil and gas pipelines. 9 of the 10 premiers to speak out against Bill C-69. A majority of the premiers to speak out against the imposition of the federal carbon tax. And we have established very strong relations. And Ms. Notley, you don't establish relations by sitting here in isolation. You do it by building the relationships. And part of that was the Stampede Premiers meeting that we hosted, where we had 6 premiers representing over 60% of the country's population expressing solidarity with Albertans on the need for resource access, for pipelines, and for fairness in the Federation. So I make absolutely no apologies. And I'll tell you, Mr. Chair, I'll just say right now, I'm going to be spending more on travel expenses to get around the country, to St. John's, to Halifax, to Iqaluit, Yellowknife, Whitehorse, to Ottawa, to strengthen those relationships. And this is a promise made and a promise kept.
So no, I think the promise made was to be careful, actually, with the resources of Albertans. And let me just back up a little bit there, because, what we saw was only Conservative premiers invited to this little Calgary breakfast. What we saw afterwards, frankly, coming out of the COP was, I got to tell you, you got them to agree on C6, or some of them to agree on C69 and C45 or 48, and that's great. But what came out of the COF was no stronger, no more definitive than what we got out of the COF in 2015, when we got all the premiers there to sign on to the Canadian energy strategy, and so the language was almost no different, and that's fine. You got them to reaffirm the position that they'd already taken before. That is great, but I don't think you needed to bribe them with a free flight after your pancake breakfast to do that. That's not building relationships. You build relationships not by yelling at people, which, quite frankly, there's been a lot of that going on with respect between you and national leaders who are not members of your party. But in addition, you can do that by just going to a meeting and having a conversation. So I appreciate that the COF meeting came out with some nice statements. Almost none of it was new. Are you seriously saying that in order to get people to sign off on communiques that look a great deal like the communiques that had been written previously, you need to pay for them to fly around the country and drag them out to a party at the Calgary Stampede?
Mr. Chair, there was no party. There was a meeting of premiers representing governments with like-minded interests, in part to express support for Alberta. It wasn't just limited to Conservative premiers. Former Premier McLeod of the Northwest Territories, who is nonpartisan, attended. Premier Legault, who is not a Conservative, was invited to attend. So this was not limited. This was not based on partisanship. It was based on relationship building. And Albertans we are famous for our hospitality. I make no apologies for offering Alberta's hospitality to premiers who have our back on a series of issues, not just in rhetorical commitments and communiques, but I am very pleased, Chair, to inform the committee that after my visit to Quebec City and my meeting with Premier Legault, for example, that his government announced it would join the several other provinces in challenging the imposition of the federal carbon tax at the Supreme Court of Canada, a tax that
he also announced that never in a million years would he support a pipeline going east. So come on.
I'm also pleased to say he announced after my meeting in Quebec his support for liquefied natural gas export opportunities. It's true that with Quebec we don't agree on every issue, but it's great to have Quebec also
Quebec already agreed on those things, Premier. This is not as a result of you spending a whole bunch of money flying people around.
It's also great that Quebec has offered to support us in our fight against the federal intrusion in our exclusive constitutional authority to produce our resources under 92A of the Constitution, which is being invaded by Bill C-68. So I am Bill C-69. So Mr. Chair, again, offering some logistical support to several premiers representing 60% of the population is what a mature government does.
Mm-hmm.
when it's trying to build relationships.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree because a $14,000 differential for a flight solely to Saskatoon, including the wives of premiers, is not something you do if you literally are trying to tell Albertans that they need, like we talked yesterday about Albertans with severe disabilities who will have $30 less a month to pay their rent, and it's their job, according to you. It's not onerous for them to chip in to help deal with the fiscal challenges that you suggest that we face, but it's okay for us to offer premiers who have access to their own travel budgets to get from point A to point B. And I think we will simply have to agree to disagree and suggest that we have different versions of what is a responsible discretionary use of so-called hospitality funds,
point, Mr. Chair.
As you do your meeting with your Conservative premiers.
The business